In this final section of our three-part overview of public education in Kansas, we're going to turn to the subject of resources, which means school funding and how the school finance system works in Kansas. To begin with, let's look at total dollars provided for each pupil. In other words, all school district revenues and expenditures divided by the head count number of students in the system. After adjusting for inflation, total expenditures per pupil increased over 50% from 1990 to 2009. But at that point were reduced, leveled off, and have only begun to come back lately. In 2020, total funding per pupil adjusted for inflation remained 2.6% lower than in 2009. The previous information talked about all revenues and expenditures. Let's look a little closer at those funds that districts have for their general operating budgets for the educational programs they provide from the state and local levels. This is their general fund budget, local option budget, and special education state aid. These funds increased about 33% from 1990 to 2009 and remain nearly 11% below the 2009 level. The difference between total revenue and these funds are they exclude capital expenditures, debt service for building costs, federal funds, KPERS pension contributions, and student fees for restricted purposes such as meals, transportation, and activities. While total funding per pupil has increased between 1990 and 2009, dropped slightly since then, school funding as a percent of total personal income has remained between 4 and 5% of incomes of all Kansans. Way of thinking about this is how much of all income of everyone who lives in Kansas is spent on public education. The answer is remained between 4 and 5% and has generally been declining for the past 10 years. Education funding has also not increased as a percent of the state budget. Since the state took over a larger share of school funding in 1993 to 94, state aid has remained about 50% of the state general fund budget ever since. So while going up on a per pupil basis, state aid has not significantly changed one way or another as a share of the Kansas general operating budget. Since at least 1992, Kansas has provided less funding per pupil than the U.S. average. Kansas came close to catching up with the U.S. average in 2009, but the gap has been widening since then. Nationally, school funding passed 2009 funding per pupil when adjusted for inflation in 2016, but Kansas was still below 2009 levels in 2018. That's the most recent year we have data available. In 2018, Kansas was right about in the middle of funding per pupil on a regional basis. North Dakota, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Iowa all provided more total funding per pupil. Missouri, Colorado, South Dakota, and Oklahoma provided less. In comparing state funding from different states, it's important to distinguish between the amount of funding that specifically comes from state revenue sources with the total funding that schools in a state receive from all sources. Kansas does provide more funding from the state than most other states, but provides less revenue per pupil from local sources and overall less funding. For example, state aid per pupil in Kansas is about $8,700 compared to just under $7,000 nationally. But locally, from local sources, mainly property taxes, Kansas provides only about $3,600 compared to $6,767 nationally. As a result, Kansas property taxes for school districts are lower than most states, but the state spends a larger share of its budget on education than most other states. A major issue in school funding in recent years has been the Gannon school finance case. In a series of decisions over the past decade, the Kansas Supreme Court found school funding had become constitutionally unsuitable for two reasons. First, it was not equitable because the state was not putting enough money into school equalization programs. As a result, there was a widening tax disparity to raise the same level of funding based on each district's wealth. The court also found the system was not adequate because too many students were failing to meet academic performance standards, and the legislature was not meeting funding levels based on previous cost studies the legislature itself had done. The new legislative study commissioned during the Gannon case also found the state was not providing adequate funding to meet its own educational goals. After a number of years of trying, the Legislature and Supreme Court finally agreed on what will be a 6-year plan to restore basic operating funding back to 2009 levels after adjusting for inflation. The legislature has approved a series of base state increases through 2023, and after that, the base is to increase at the same rate as inflation. However, not all of those years have had the money actually appropriated yet. School districts receive funding from 3 major sources: state aid, federal aid, and money they raise locally. In Kansas, about 2/3 of total funding comes from the state. The biggest part is general state aid, what some people call base state aid per pupil, which has the fewest strings attached, although some of this is associated with weightings that must be used in particular ways. The state also provides funding for special education, and it provides matching aid to match local resources for local option budgets, bond and interest aid, and capital outlay aid. The state also fully pays the cost of contributions to the retirement system for school employees. Federal aid provides about 8% of school funding. A little more than half of that goes to educational programs like Title I programs you might have heard about, federal special education aid, vocational aid, and the rest is federal food service aid. Local revenues go to pay the local portion of local option budgets, the local share of bond and interest costs and capital outlay cost, and all other local dollars include things like student fees, meal money, textbook fees, and any other local revenues that districts have. Now, let's look at some of the characteristics and differences in Kansas school districts that have an impact on their cost and how the school finance formula responds to that. To begin with, Kansas has 286 school districts, but the top 7, with more than 10,000 students each, enroll almost 35% of all students in the state. The next 37 districts in size, between 2,000 and 10,000 students, educate another 35% of Kansas students. The remaining 242 districts, with fewer than 2,000 students each, educate the final 30% of Kansas students, and these go down to below 100 students each. Studies have shown that smaller districts have higher operating costs per pupil than larger districts because of fixed costs that are spread over fewer students. So Kansas uses a low enrollment weighting factor, giving more money for districts with fewer than 1,622 students. The lower enrollment goes, the more value there is to this weighting and the higher amount per pupil. Districts with more than 1,622 students also receive a high enrollment weighting, but it's the same amount for every child. Another area where districts vary dramatically is in the percent of low-income students, those eligible for free or reduced price meals. Kansas districts range from fewer than 10% to over 80% of students eligible for lunch support. Most districts have at least 30% of students eligible, and over half have more than 50%. Because low-income students have more difficulties in school, districts with high percentages of free reduced price eligible students have much lower average test scores and therefore many more students scoring below proficient thresholds. Kansas uses at-risk weighting to provide additional funding for districts based on their free lunch enrollment. Another way Kansas school districts differ dramatically is in local property tax wealth per pupil. In other words, the valuation districts could tax to raise money. School districts range from a high of over $600,000 in taxable wealth per pupil to a low of almost zero at the Fort Leavenworth military base. Even if you remove the extremes in local property wealth, taking out the top roughly 19% of highest wealth districts and the lowest at almost zero, Per pupil taxable property wealth ranges from over $140,000 to about $27,000 per pupil. Under state law, districts above the 81.2 percentile do not receive any equalization aid for local option budgets. Those below that level are equalized so that they can raise a similar amount of revenue with a similar tax effort.